The alarm on my console screamed before I even finished my coffee, and I knew, in that first half-second, that hour one of this diagnostic was not going to be routine. My name is Vesith Kaur, and I have spent 11 years running intake scans on newly discovered species for the Confederate Science Directorate. I have seen creatures with 6 hearts, creatures that breathe fire instead of air, creatures that scream when you shine a light on them. None of them ever made my hands shake the way this one did, and she had not even said a word yet. The girl sitting in the diagnostic chair in front of me looked like nothing. That was the problem. She looked like nothing at all. Thin arms, tired eyes, brown hair tied back in a loose knot, wearing the plain gray intake suit we give every new subject. Her name, according to the file glowing on my tablet, was Nora Callahan, 17 years old, pulled 3 days ago from a planet our long-range survey teams had flagged as Class 9. Class 9 is our highest hazard rating. It means gravity crushes bone. It means the air itself can kill you if the temperature swings the wrong way at the wrong hour. It means almost nothing survives there for more than a season. Nora had survived there for 17 years. "Please state your name and species for the record," I said, keeping my voice level the way I always do, the way we are trained to do, because calm voices keep subjects calm, and calm subjects give cleaner data. "Nora," she said. "Human, you already know that. It's on your little screen." I looked up from my tablet. Most new subjects do not talk back on the first exchange. Most new subjects are frightened, or confused, or angry, and it takes hours before they trust their voice enough to make a joke. She had been in the chair for 4 minutes. "I do already know that," I admitted. "I ask anyway. It helps calibrate your voice pattern against stress." "Then I guess my voice pattern is calibrated to sarcasm," she said, and something in her eyes almost smiled, even though her mouth did not move much at all. Behind me, my assistant, a quiet young researcher named Toma Bright, cleared his throat the way he does when he wants my attention without wanting to interrupt me in front of a subject. I stepped back from the chair and lowered my voice. "Her baseline readings came in already," he whispered, "before you even started the verbal intake." "That's not possible," I said. "The scan sequence hasn't started." "It started the second she sat down," Toma said, and turned his tablet toward me. I looked at the numbers, and for the first time in 11 years, I felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the recycled air of the station. Her resting heart rate was elevated, which was normal for a new subject in an unfamiliar environment. But her cortisol levels, the hormone that measures stress, were dropping, actively dropping, in real time, on a downward curve so smooth it looked artificial, as if her body had already decided that whatever was happening to her was not worth being afraid of, and was actively working to convince the rest of her system to agree. "Recalibrate the sensor," I told Toma. "It's reading wrong." He recalibrated it. The numbers held. I looked back at Nora. She was watching me, with the patient expression of someone who has been stared at by strangers many times before and has stopped finding it interesting. "Is something wrong with your machine?" she asked. "No," I said, even though every instinct told me something was very right with her machine and very wrong with everything I thought I understood about human biology. "We're just beginning. This is a routine 100-hour diagnostic. We'll be monitoring your body's baseline functions, your reactions to a series of controlled tests, and your overall adaptive capacity. It will feel long. I want you to know that up front." 100 hours, she repeated. "You people really don't rush things, do you? Not when it comes to deciding whether a new species is safe to bring into contact with the wider Confederation, no." She tilted her head slightly. "Safe for who? Us or you?" I did not have a ready answer for that, and the fact that I did not have a ready answer bothered me more than it should have. I told her we would begin with a simple reflex test, and I stepped back to the observation panel, where Toma was still staring at the readout like it had personally offended him. "Doctor," he said quietly, "her cortisol is still falling." "I see that. It's been 11 minutes. I can count, Toma." "Doctor, at this rate, in another 20 minutes, Her stress hormone will register as lower than someone in a resting meditative state. She is sitting in a chair, surrounded by an alien research team, on a station orbiting a planet she has never seen before in her life, about to begin a 100-hour medical procedure with no guarantee of what happens after, and her body is calming down. I did not say anything, because I was thinking the exact same thing, and saying it out loud would have made it feel more real than I was ready for. The first physical test was simple: a calibrated pressure pad against her palm, increasing in intensity at a slow, measured rate, designed to establish a baseline pain threshold. Every species we test responds differently. Some pull away almost immediately. Some show no visible reaction until the pain crosses a certain point, and then react suddenly and sharply. It is one of the most basic tests we run, and I have overseen it hundreds of times. I placed the pad against Nora's palm and began the sequence. At the standard threshold where most humanoid species from soft, comfortable worlds begin to flinch, she did nothing. Her hand stayed relaxed. I watched her face. Nothing. I increased the pressure past the point where I have seen hardened Confederate Marines request a pause. Nothing. Her pulse ticked up, slightly, the only sign that her body registered the input at all. "You can tell me if this is uncomfortable," I said. "It's uncomfortable," she said, in the same even tone she had used to make her joke about my machine. "You're allowed to react." "I am reacting. I just told you it's uncomfortable." Most subjects show some kind of physical response, a flinch, a change in breathing. She looked at the pad pressing into her palm, then back at me. "Where I'm from, if you flinch every time something hurts, you don't have time to notice the thing that's actually trying to hurt you worse. You learn to sort it. This hurts. Fine. Keep moving. That hurts. That's the one that kills you. Pay attention to that one." I stopped the test early. I told myself it was because I had gathered sufficient data. That was not entirely true. I stopped because I needed a moment away from the chair to write something down that I did not want her, or anyone else on my team, to see just yet. I keep 2 notebooks during every intake diagnostic. One is standard procedure, logged automatically to the Central Directorate Archive the moment I close each entry, available to my supervisor and any oversight committee that wants to review it. The other is a private notebook, handwritten, meant only for my own working thoughts before I decide what belongs in the official record. Every researcher keeps something like it. It is not against policy. It is simply not shared. I opened the private notebook for the first time that day and wrote a single line. Subject's pain threshold is not elevated. Subject's relationship to pain is different. She is not tolerating discomfort. She is filing it. I looked at that sentence for a long moment before I closed the notebook and went back to the chair, because somewhere in the back of my mind, a very old, very quiet warning system that every field scientist develops after enough years in this job was starting to hum, low and steady, like a machine that has just been switched on and has not yet decided how loud it intends to get. Nora was still sitting there, patient, waiting, watching the ceiling lights of my lab like she was cataloging the exits. "How many more hours until this is done?" she asked, without looking at me. 99, I said. She exhaled slowly through her nose, the closest thing to a real reaction I had gotten out of her all day. "Then I guess we'd better keep going," she said, and settled deeper into the chair, and I remember thinking, even then, before I understood even a fraction of what I was looking at, that I was in a room with something the size of a teenage girl and the patience of a species that had survived 1,000 things that should have ended it, and that I had a very long way to go before I understood what that actually meant. I had no idea, at hour 1, how right I was. By hour 12, I had stopped trusting my own instruments, and that is not a small thing for a scientist to admit, even to herself. The station where we conduct these diagnostics is called Intake 7, a research platform built specifically for first contact biology, orbiting quietly outside the boundaries of any inhabited system so that no unproven species can accidentally learn anything about Confederate territory before we decide whether they are ready to know it exists. It is small, efficient, and built for control. Every wall panel, every light fixture, Every chair is designed to keep a subject calm and a scientist safe. I had worked inside those walls for 6 years before Nora Callahan ever sat down in my chair, and in all that time, I had never once needed to walk out of the observation room to steady my breathing. I needed to that night. Toma found me in the corridor outside the lab, leaning against the wall with my eyes closed, and he did not say anything at first. He just waited, the way a good assistant learns to wait, until I was ready to talk. Her cellular repair markers came back, he finally said. And? They don't make sense. I pushed off the wall and followed him back inside, because if there is one thing 11 years in this profession teaches you, it is that data that does not make sense is either broken equipment or the beginning of something you were not prepared for, and I needed to know which one I was looking at. The readout on the main screen showed a graph I had seen 1,000 times before, tracking how quickly a subject's body repairs minor tissue damage after a controlled, painless microabrasion test, a standard part of every diagnostic. In most species, repair begins in response to damage. The body detects an injury and cellular processes activate to fix it. It is a reactive system. Damage happens first, then repair follows. Nora's readings showed something different. In the seconds before the microabrasion device even touched her skin, her local cellular activity had already begun shifting, subtly, in the exact location where the device was about to make contact. Not everywhere on her arm, not randomly, precisely at the point of future contact, before contact occurred. That's not possible, I said, for the second time that day, and I was beginning to hate how often I was saying it. I ran it 4 times, Toma said. Different points on her arm each time, different intervals, different device angles so she couldn't predict it from sound or vibration alone. Same result every time. Her body starts preparing for damage before the damage happens. How would she know where the device was going to touch her? I don't think she does know, not consciously. I don't think this is her choosing anything. I think it's just what her body does now, like it's learned to expect harm before harm arrives, so thoroughly that the expectation itself has become part of her biology. I sat down slowly in the chair across from the monitor, because my legs did not feel entirely steady, and I thought about her voice from earlier that day. This hurts. Fine. Keep moving. That hurts. That's the one that kills you. Pay attention to that one. A survival philosophy spoken so simply, I had almost missed how strange it truly was. She had not been describing a mindset. She had been describing a biological reality that her species had been shaped into, generation after generation, on a world that had tried to kill every single one of her ancestors, over and over, for longer than our own recorded history. I went back into the main lab. Nora was asleep in the observation bed we had set up for the required rest interval between test blocks, her breathing slow and even, one hand curled loosely near her chin. I stood at the edge of the bed for a long moment, watching her, and she did not look dangerous. She looked like a tired teenager. I was beginning to understand exactly the problem. I opened my private notebook again. Subjects' biological systems appear to operate on anticipation rather than reaction. This is not a trained skill. This is inherited adaptation, refined across generations on a hostile world. If this pattern extends across other systems, we may be looking at a species whose baseline survival capability exceeds standard Confederate defense personnel by a significant margin. I stared at that last sentence for a long time before I closed the notebook, because I understood, even as I wrote it, exactly what it would mean if it turned out to be true, and exactly what the Directorate does with species it classifies as a survival risk. Hour 20 came and went, with a full battery of cognitive tests, standard puzzles, and pattern recognition exercises we use to establish baseline intelligence and problem-solving speed. Nora finished every one of them faster than our projected average, not by a small margin, but by enough that Toma had to run the timing software twice to confirm it was not malfunctioning. When I asked her how she had solved the final and most difficult puzzle, a spatial reasoning problem designed to take most new subjects between 10 and 15 minutes, in under 90 seconds, She shrugged. I grew up finding the fastest way through things, she said. Fastest way through a flooded ravine before the water rose. Fastest way up a rock face before the light failed. This is easier than any of that. This is just shapes. You make it sound like your entire childhood was a series of emergencies. It was, she said, without any drama in her voice at all, the way someone describes the weather. That's just what growing up there is. You get good at emergencies, or you don't get old. Hour 30 brought the cortisol readings back to my attention, because they had not simply dropped and stabilized the way I expected. They kept dropping slowly, steadily, hour after hour, as if her body was continuing to recalibrate its own definition of danger the longer she remained in an environment that, by her standards, apparently posed very little threat at all. A space station full of unfamiliar alien researchers, a 100-hour medical procedure with no promise of a comfortable outcome, and her stress levels were behaving as though she were somewhere closer to safe than she had ever been in her life. I found myself asking her, near the end of that hour, a question that was not on my approved test list. Are you afraid of anything, Nora? She considered the question with more seriousness than I expected. I used to be afraid of the dark, she said. Where I grew up, the things that hunted at night were faster than the things that hunted in daylight, so darkness meant something specific. It meant pay attention, or don't wake up. I'm not afraid of your kind of dark, though. Your dark doesn't have teeth in it. And now? Here, in this lab, surrounded by strangers, with no idea what happens to you after this is finished? She looked at me for a long moment before she answered, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly, into something I had not seen from her yet. Should I be afraid of what happens after this is finished? She asked. I did not answer her right away, and the silence stretched a beat too long. Long enough that she noticed it, long enough that something behind her eyes sharpened, just slightly, the way a person's expression changes when they realize a question they asked lightly has landed somewhere heavier than they intended. I don't know yet, I finally said, which was the truth, and also somehow felt like the least honest thing I had said to her all day. My supervisor, Director Halson Vray, contacted me for the first of what would become many check-ins near the end of hour 32. Director Vray oversaw first contact biology for the entire sector, a position that came with the kind of authority that made even senior researchers choose their words carefully around him. His voice came through my earpiece flat and businesslike, the way it always did. Status on the human subject, he said, not as a question. Diagnostic proceeding on schedule, I said. Baseline data collection is ongoing. Anything notable so far? I looked through the observation window at Nora, sitting quietly with a nutrient drink in her hands, watching the stars drift past the reinforced viewport with an expression I could not quite read. Nothing outside expected parameters for a hardship world subject, I said. It was the first time in 11 years I had lied in an official report, and it came out of my mouth so smoothly that it frightened me almost as much as her cortisol readings had. Director Vray made a small sound of acknowledgement and ended the call, and I stood there in the quiet hum of the lab for a long time afterward, holding my earpiece in my hand, thinking about the 2 notebooks sitting on my desk, one of them growing heavier with every hour that passed, and wondering how many more hours I had before I would need to decide, permanently and completely, which version of the truth I was actually going to tell. Hour 45 was when I stopped calling it a diagnostic in my own head and started calling it something closer to a countdown, though I did not yet understand what exactly we were counting down toward. The next block of tests focused on environmental adaptability, and this was the part of the intake process I had always found the least surprising with previous species, because it mostly measured obvious physical traits. How well does a subject regulate body temperature across extreme ranges? How efficiently does a subject's respiratory system process thin or contaminated air? How quickly does a subject recover from oxygen deprivation? These are simple numbers, usually predictable once you understand a species' homeworld conditions. Nora's numbers were not predictable. They were something else entirely. We placed her in the environmental chamber, a sealed room capable of simulating temperature extremes, atmospheric changes, and pressure shifts under full medical monitoring, with an emergency override that could flood the chamber with breathable, stabilized air within 2 seconds if any reading crossed a safety threshold. It is one of the safest rooms on the entire station. I have run this test on subjects who panicked the moment the door sealed shut, simply from the sound of the mechanism locking. Nora watched the door seal with mild curiosity, the way someone watches a door close in an elevator they have ridden 100 times before. We began lowering the temperature slowly, a controlled descent designed to measure the exact point at which her body began showing signs of distress. Most humanoid species from temperate worlds begin showing measurable stress responses within a narrow, predictable range. I expected something similar from her, adjusted slightly upward, given what we already knew about her homeworld's harsh conditions. Her body did not show distress. It showed something closer to preparation. As the temperature dropped, her blood flow began redirecting toward her core and vital organs in a pattern so efficient that Toma actually laughed out loud at the readout, a short, startled sound that he immediately apologized for. Her body is doing in real time what most cold-weather survival training takes months to teach a person to do voluntarily, he said, except she's not doing it voluntarily. It's automatic. We pushed the temperature lower than any previous test subject from a comparable species had ever tolerated without medical intervention, and Nora sat cross-legged on the chamber floor, arms wrapped around her knees, breathing slow and controlled, watching the frost begin to form on the observation window with an expression that looked almost bored. "You can end this whenever you want," I said through the chamber intercom. "You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not trying to prove anything," she said, her breath fogging faintly in front of her face. "This isn't even close to the worst cold I've felt. Where I'm from, this would be considered a mild evening." I ended the test not because her readings demanded it, but because I found I could no longer watch the frost creeping across that window without a growing, uncomfortable weight settling behind my ribs, and I needed a moment to understand why. I understood it fully an hour later, sitting alone in my office with the lights dimmed, staring at a projection of every result we had gathered so far, laid out together for the first time in a single visual field. Individually, each result had seemed like an isolated curiosity, something strange but explainable, something I could file away with a note and move past. Laid out together, connected across 60 hours of data, they stopped looking like isolated curiosities and started looking like a pattern. Every single system in Nora Callahan's body was optimized not for comfort, not for efficiency in a stable environment, but for survival under conditions that would kill almost anything else we had ever tested. Her pain response filtered threats instead of simply registering them. Her cellular repair anticipated damage before it occurred. Her cardiovascular system redirected resources with a speed and precision that outpaced trained physiological conditioning in hardened Confederate soldiers. Her cognitive processing prioritized the fastest viable path through any problem placed in front of her, a mind built not for leisurely contemplation, but for rapid, high-stakes decision-making under pressure. None of these traits, on their own, were unprecedented. I had seen individual species with exceptional pain tolerance. I had seen individual species with efficient thermal regulation. What I had never seen, in 11 years and 400 diagnostics, was every single trait pointing in the exact same direction at once, all of it converging toward a single, unmistakable truth that I finally allowed myself to write down in my private notebook, in full, without softening it. Her species was not simply tough. Her species had been shaped, generation after generation, by a world that killed the slow, the unprepared, and the unlucky, leaving only the ones who could survive anything, and they had not just survived. They had adapted so thoroughly that survival itself had become their baseline state of being, the ordinary condition of an ordinary day, so unremarkable to them that a 17-year-old girl could sit in a freezing chamber and call it a mild evening. I closed the notebook and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about every Deathworld classification report I had ever read in the Directorate archives, all the way back to the earliest days of Confederate first contact policy. I had always understood, in an abstract way, why those reports existed. Some worlds produced species too dangerous to bring into contact carelessly. Some species needed to be observed, restricted, sometimes contained, before the wider Confederation was exposed to whatever violent, unstable traits their harsh origins had burned into them. I had never once, in 11 years, questioned whether that framework was actually built to protect the Confederation, or whether it might simply be built to protect the Confederation's comfortable place at the top of a very long, very old hierarchy. I did not sleep that night. I do not think I was capable of it. Hour 75 arrived with a scheduled psychological evaluation, a series of structured conversations meant to establish emotional stability, social reasoning, and what the directorate calls threat perception, meaning how a subject identifies and responds to danger, both real and perceived. It is usually one of the quieter parts of the diagnostic. I did not expect it to be quiet with Nora, and I was right, though not in the way I anticipated. "Tell me about your family," I said, beginning with the standard opening question. "My mother died when I was 9, Nora said, without hesitation, without visible distress, the way someone recites a fact they have long since made peace with. A flash flood came through our settlement, faster than the warning system could catch it. She got me to high ground. She didn't make it back down in time to get herself there too." I did not have a scripted follow-up for that kind of answer, and I found myself asking, instead, the question that had been sitting under my ribs since hour 30. "Why aren't you afraid?" I asked, "of any of this, of me, of what happens after this diagnostic ends. You've been sitting in this station for 3 days, surrounded by strangers who could decide the future of your entire species, and you talk about your mother's death the same way you talk about the weather." Nora was quiet for a moment, and for the first time since she had arrived, I saw something pass behind her eyes that looked less like calm and more like exhaustion carefully held in place. "Should I be afraid?" she asked again, the same question from hour 12, except this time her voice had lost its lightness entirely. "I don't know," I said, and this time I let the honesty sit there, unguarded, because I was too tired to hide it. "I genuinely don't know yet." "Then I'll wait until you do," she said. "Being afraid before you know what you're afraid of just wastes the energy you'll need once you actually find out." I wrote that sentence down word for word in my private notebook because it explained, more clearly than any biological reading I had gathered in 75 hours, exactly what kind of mind her world had built. Not fearless, efficient with fear. Rationing it the way her ancestors must have rationed water, food, warmth, every scarce resource a hostile world ever offered them, spending it only when spending it would actually help her survive whatever came next. Director Vray contacted me again near the end of hour 78, and this time his voice carried an edge I had not heard from him before. "I've reviewed your submitted reports," he said. "They're unusually thin for this stage of a diagnostic." "The subject is proceeding through standard testing without complication," I said, holding my voice as level as I had trained myself to hold it for 11 years. "Dr. Kaur, I have overseen 40 Deathworld intake diagnostics in my career, and I have never once seen a scientist submit this little data at hour 78. Either you are behind on your documentation, or you are choosing not to document something. I would like to know which." My hand tightened around my stylus, and I looked through the observation window at Nora, who was resting quietly on the observation bed, one arm thrown over her eyes to block out the light, breathing slow and even, seemingly at peace, in a place designed to be anything but peaceful. "I am behind on documentation," I said. "The volume of data this subject is generating has exceeded standard processing time. I will have a complete report ready by the conclusion of the diagnostic at hour 100. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if he had already guessed at the shape of what I was not saying. "See that you do," he finally said, and ended the call. I sat back in my chair and looked at the 2 notebooks on my desk, the thin official log, full of careful, technically accurate half-truths, and the private notebook, now nearly full, containing every honest observation I had made since hour 1. 22 hours remained. 22 hours to decide what kind of scientist I actually was, and what kind of future I was willing to risk everything to protect. I did not know yet, but I was beginning, for the first time in 11 years, to suspect that I already did, and simply was not ready to admit it to myself. Hour 83 began with an alarm I had never heard before in 6 years, on intake 7, and for 3 full seconds, standing frozen in the middle of the lab with Nora watching me from the observation bed, I genuinely believed the station itself was about to fail. It was not the station. It was worse, in a different way. The alert came from the outer hull, a debris warning, a small but fast-moving cluster of asteroid fragments that our long-range sensors had failed to catch early enough because of an unlikely combination of the station's orbital angle and a sudden, unpredicted shift in a nearby gravitational field. Toma's face had gone pale reading the trajectory projections on the main screen. "Impact in under 4 minutes," he said, his voice tight and clipped, in the way people get when panic is trying to climb up through their throat and they are fighting to keep it down. Section 3 shielding can handle most of it, but the projection shows at least one fragment large enough to breach the outer wall of the environmental testing wing. The environmental testing wing was where we had run Nora's cold chamber test 20 hours earlier. It was, at that exact moment, completely empty of personnel, but it sat directly adjacent to the secondary life support conduit that fed breathable air to nearly a third of the station, including the observation room where Nora was currently sitting up, alert now, watching the emergency lighting begin to pulse red along the ceiling with an expression that had shifted, instantly and completely, from calm to focused. "What's happening?" she said. Not a frightened question, but a request for information, delivered in a voice that had gone flat and clear in a way I had not heard from her before. "Debris impact," I said. "We have automated countermeasures. It should be handled." "Should be," she repeated, catching exactly what I had not meant to reveal in those 2 words. The station's automated defense grid engaged, a series of point defense emitters designed to intercept incoming debris before impact, and for a moment I believed Toma's projection had been wrong, that the danger had passed, that hour 83 would end up being nothing more than a frightening entry in the official log. Then the lighting flickered, the low hum of the station's system stuttered audibly, and Toma's voice cracked as he read the new numbers off his screen. "One of the emitters failed," he said. "The largest fragment is still inbound. Impact in 90 seconds. It's going to hit the environmental wing. Evacuate the corridor," I said, already moving toward the door, my mind racing through emergency protocol sequences I had trained on but never actually needed to use. "Seal the bulkhead between the lab and the environmental wing. Full lockdown. Now." Toma's hands flew across the console, and the heavy blast door at the far end of the lab began sliding shut with a groan of straining mechanisms, but even as it moved, I could see, on the secondary display, that the bulkhead's automated seal was reading at only 60% structural integrity, a maintenance flag that had apparently been logged and not yet addressed, one of 100 small, forgivable oversights that stations like ours accumulate over years of operation and rarely think about until the exact moment they matter most. "That door won't hold a full breach," Toma said, and I could hear, underneath the professional calm he was trying to maintain, the same rising panic I could feel building in my own chest. 60 seconds. I turned toward the observation bed to tell Nora to move to the reinforced section of the lab, the small secondary chamber built to withstand exactly this kind of emergency, and found that she was already standing, already moving, her eyes scanning the room with a speed and precision that reminded me, in that instant, of every reading I had gathered over the past 83 hours, every trait that had seemed strange and academic in a controlled testing environment, suddenly becoming something else entirely, something immediate and real and unfolding directly in front of me. "That door is going to fail before it seals," she said. "Not a guess, a calculation, delivered in the same flat, clear voice. "How do you know that?" "I don't know it. I can see it. It's moving too slow for the gap it's trying to close, and I can hear the strain in the motor. It's not going to make it." 40 seconds. "There's a secondary chamber," I said, pointing toward the reinforced room at the back of the lab. "Get inside, seal the inner hatch. It can withstand a full hull breach." "What about you and him?" she said, nodding toward Toma, who was still frantically working the console, trying to force the failing bulkhead to close faster than its mechanism was rated to move. "We have to make sure the seal engages, or the whole lab loses pressure, not just this section." 30 seconds. Nora did not move toward the secondary chamber. Instead, she crossed the room in 4 quick controlled strides and grabbed a heavy equipment case from beside the environmental testing console, the kind used to store diagnostic instruments, solid reinforced alloy, and wedged it directly into the gap the failing bulkhead had not yet managed to close, angling it with a speed and precision that looked less like panic and more like something she had practiced 100 times before, on a world that had given her far less warning than 90 seconds. "That case can't stop a hull breach," I said, my voice rising in a way I rarely allowed it to rise. "It's not supposed to stop it," she said, already stepping back, already moving toward Toma, grabbing his arm and pulling him bodily away from the console toward the secondary chamber, with a strength that should not have been possible from someone her size. "It's supposed to slow it down long enough for that door to finish closing. Move." 15 seconds. I do not remember deciding to run. I remember the sound first, a deep groaning impact that shook the entire lab, the lights flickering violently, the equipment case Nora had wedged into the gap shrieking against the alloy frame as something struck the outer hull with enough force to rattle the walls around us, and then, impossibly, the bulkhead finishing its seal, locking into place with a heavy, final thud just as the pressure alarms began to fade instead of intensify. For a long moment none of us moved. The emergency lighting continued to pulse red, casting long shadows across the lab, and the only sound was Toma's ragged breathing beside me and the slow, steady hiss of the station's systems recalibrating. "Structural integrity holding," Toma finally said, his voice shaking as he stared at the readout. "Breach contained to the environmental wing. No casualties, no pressure loss beyond Section 3. I turned to look at Nora, who was standing near the sealed bulkhead, one hand still resting against the wall, watching the emergency lights with the same patient, focused expression she had worn since the alarm first sounded, as though the last 90 seconds had been nothing more than another test, in a diagnostic she had already decided, somewhere deep in her calm, calculating mind, that she was fully capable of passing. "How did you know to do that?" I asked, my voice unsteady in a way I did not try to hide. "The case, the timing, all of it. You've never operated equipment like that in your life." She looked at me, and for the first time something in her expression softened, not into fear, but into something closer to understanding, as though she was seeing, clearly, for the first time, exactly how far apart our two worlds truly were. "Where I'm from, you don't get warning alarms," she said quietly. "You get a sound, or a shadow, or a feeling in your gut that something's wrong, and you have about as much time as we just had, sometimes less, to figure out what will slow the thing down long enough for the actual solution to work. I've never used equipment like that, but I've used a fallen tree to slow a mudslide, and a door to slow a flood, and my own body to slow something I probably shouldn't talk about in a room with recording equipment. The logic is the same. Find the thing that buys you time, use it, worry about being scared later." I did not have a response to that. I stood there in the flickering red light of a lab that had nearly been torn open by an accident of orbital mechanics, looking at a 17-year-old girl who had, in the space of 90 seconds, made a faster, more accurate structural assessment than my own trained assistant, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold and absolute somewhere behind my ribs, that everything I had been writing in my private notebook for the past 83 hours was no longer theoretical. I had just watched it happen. Director Vray's voice came through the station's emergency channel less than 10 minutes later, requesting a full incident report, and I realized, standing there in the settling dust of the environmental wing's damaged bulkhead, that I no longer had 90 seconds to decide what to write. I had 17 hours left until the diagnostic officially concluded, and somewhere in those 17 hours, I was going to have to decide, once and for all, whether the truth I had been avoiding since hour 1 was something I was willing to hand over to a directorate that had never, in its entire history, responded to a species this capable with anything other than fear, restriction, and control. I already knew what my answer was going to be. I had known it, I think, since hour 12, when I first watched her cellular readings prepare for damage that had not yet arrived. I simply had not yet found the courage to write it down where anyone else could see it. That courage arrived at hour 91, in a conversation I did not expect and could not have prepared for, and it changed everything about how the final hours of that diagnostic would unfold. Hour 91 arrived quietly, without alarms, without debris, without any of the drama that had defined hour 83, and somehow that quiet felt more dangerous than the emergency had, because it gave me nothing to do except sit with everything I already knew and finally decide what to do with it. Director Vray requested a private audio channel, no video, which was unusual for him, and unusual enough that I felt my pulse quicken the moment his voice came through my earpiece, low and careful in a way I had never heard from him before. I read the incident report from hour 83, he said. The debris strike. Your subject wedged an equipment case into a failing bulkhead and pulled your assistant to safety with what the medical scan afterward described as force output exceeding standard human baseline by a significant margin. That's accurate, I said, keeping my voice as flat as I could manage. You described her actions in that report as instinctive survival behavior consistent with her homeworld's hazard classification, he said. I want to know if that description is complete, or if it is, like your earlier reports, unusually thin. I closed my eyes for a moment. Nora was resting in the observation room, the final rest interval before the last block of tests, and I could see her through the window, lying quietly on the bed, one arm behind her head, staring up at the ceiling with the same watchful patience she had carried since hour 1. Director, I said, may I ask you something before I answer that? Go ahead. What happens to a species that fails this diagnostic? Not the official policy language, the actual outcome. What happens to them? There was a pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if he intended to answer at all. It depends on the severity of the classification, he finally said. Mild cases receive extended observation before limited contact is approved. Moderate cases are restricted to supervised contact zones indefinitely, with regular reassessment. Severe cases are quarantined from Confederate contact entirely, their homeworld marked as an exclusion zone, their species left undisturbed and unaware that contact was ever considered, for their own protection and for the protection of the wider Confederation. And what happens, I said slowly, to a species that passes every individual test within acceptable parameters, but whose overall biological profile suggests a capability for survival, adaptation, and physical resilience that exceeds every species currently within the Confederation? Another long pause. When Director Vray spoke again, his voice had lost its careful, businesslike edge, and something older, more tired, had crept into it instead. That classification does not currently exist in Directorate policy, Dr. Kaur, because in the history of the Confederation, it has never come up, which tells me you are no longer asking a hypothetical question. I looked through the window at Nora again. She had turned her head slightly and was looking back at me now, through the glass, her expression unreadable at this distance, though something in the set of her shoulders told me she understood, in whatever quiet, instinctive way her mind processed danger, that something important was happening on the other side of that window. I need to know what happens to her, I said, before I finish this report. I need to know, specifically, what happens to Nora Callahan and to every human being on her homeworld if I write down, in full, everything I have documented over the past 91 hours. That is not information I am authorized to guarantee to a researcher mid-diagnostic, Director Vray said. "You know that." "I know what the policy says," I said. "I am asking what you believe will actually happen. You have overseen 40 of these. You know how the committee thinks. Tell me the truth, Director, and I will decide, on my own, what to do with the truth I have gathered here." The silence stretched long enough that I began to think the channel had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reluctant, as though he was admitting something he had spent a long career trying not to say out loud. "If your data shows what I suspect it shows," he said, "the committee will not see a species to welcome. They will see a threat to be contained before it grows large enough to become a threat to us. There is no version of Confederate policy, current or historical, that responds to overwhelming survival capability with open arms. We have never once, in 300 years, encountered a species stronger than ourselves and chosen to trust it. I am not proud of that. I am simply telling you the truth you asked for." I sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling over me like something physical, and when I finally spoke again, my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Thank you, Director," I said. "I'll have my final report ready at the conclusion of hour 100. I ended the channel before he could respond and sat alone in the quiet hum of my office, looking at the 2 notebooks on my desk, one final time. The thin, careful official log and the thick, honest private notebook, nearly 90 pages now, filled with every true observation I had made since the moment Nora Callahan first sat down in my diagnostic chair and asked if my machine was broken. I thought about her mother, dead in a flood that gave the family less than an hour of warning. I thought about a girl who rationed her fear the way her ancestors had rationed water. I thought about a body that prepared for wounds before they happened, and a mind built for the fastest path through any danger placed in front of it, and a species that had been shaped, brutally and completely, by a world that offered no mercy and demanded, in return, nothing less than total adaptation. And I thought about what people like Director Vray and the committee above him, and 300 years of careful, fearful Confederate policy would do with a species like that, given the chance, if they saw the truth in full. I did not sleep during the final rest interval. Instead, I walked back into the lab and sat down across from Nora, who was awake, watching me with the quiet, patient attention she had shown since hour 1. 9 hours left, she said. 9 hours, I agreed. "You look like someone who's about to make a decision they're scared of," she said. I recognized the look. I've worn it myself a few times. I almost laughed, despite everything, at the simple, direct accuracy of that observation. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Off the record, not part of the diagnostic. You can ask me anything. I can't promise I'll like the question. If I told you that everything I've learned about you over the past 91 hours could be used to protect your people, or it could be used to lock them away from the rest of the universe forever, out of fear, what would you want me to do with it?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had none of its usual lightness, only a steady, careful honesty that I understood. In that moment, she had probably never offered to a stranger before. "I'd want you to do whatever keeps my people free, to keep becoming whatever we're going to become," she said. "Not contained, not studied like a danger waiting to happen, just left alone long enough to prove, on our own terms, what we actually are. We've spent our whole history proving ourselves to a planet that never once gave us the benefit of the doubt. I'd like, just once, to be given the chance to prove something to people instead of surviving in spite of them." I looked at her for a long time after that, and something inside me, some final hesitation I had been carrying since hour 1, quietly settled into certainty. "Okay," I said. "Okay, what?" "Get some rest," I said, standing up. 9 hours left. Let's finish this properly." I walked back to my office, sat down at my desk, and picked up my private notebook, 90 pages of the most honest scientific work I had ever done in 11 years, and I understood, with total clarity, exactly what I was going to do with it once the diagnostic reached its final hour. I was not going to hand it to anyone. Hour 100 arrived exactly the way every diagnostic ends, with a soft chime from the lab's central console and a message on my screen confirming that all required testing intervals had been completed in full. I stood in front of that message for a long moment before I acknowledged it, because some part of me understood that the moment I did, everything that came after would be entirely my own responsibility, with no more hours left to hide behind the excuse of an ongoing procedure. Nora sat in the diagnostic chair one final time, not because any test required it, but because it felt, to both of us, like the proper place to end what had started there 4 days earlier. She looked different than she had at hour 1, though I could not have said exactly what had changed. Perhaps it was simply that I now understood what I was looking at, and understanding changes how a person appears, even when nothing about them has physically shifted at all. "It's done," she said, not a question. "It's done," I confirmed. "So what happens now?" I sat down across from her, my private notebook resting closed in my lap, and I told her the truth, because after everything we had survived together over the past 100 hours, I owed her nothing less. "I have 2 versions of what happened here," I said. "One is the complete truth, 90 pages of it, documenting exactly what your body and mind are capable of, exactly how thoroughly your species has adapted to survive conditions that would kill almost anything else the Confederation has ever encountered. If I submit that version, my supervisor believes, and I have come to believe as well, that the Directorate will not see a species worth welcoming. They will see a threat worth containing, permanently, out of fear." "And the other version," she said. "The other version says what a nervous, cautious committee expects to hear. Baseline adaptive resilience, consistent with hazard world origin. No unusual capability escalation. No containment recommendation required. It downplays everything I have actually witnessed, everything I actually know to be true, in favor of a conclusion that lets your people continue exactly as they are, unrestricted, unobserved beyond the standard limited contact protocols every new species receives." Nora was quiet for a long moment, watching me with an expression I finally understood, after 100 hours, well enough to read. "That's a lie," she said. "The second version, it's a lie you'd be telling an entire government." "Yes," I said. "It is. Why would you do that? You've spent 11 years building a career on telling the truth about what you find. I read your file before I ever met you, Dr. Kaur. You have a reputation for precision, for honesty. This would end that reputation the moment anyone ever found out." I looked down at the notebook in my lap, 90 pages of careful, honest observation that no one but me would ever read in full, and I thought about her answer from 9 hours earlier, spoken with a quiet certainty I had not been able to stop thinking about since. I'd like, just once, to be given the chance to prove something to people instead of surviving in spite of them. "Because the truth isn't always the same thing as justice," I said. "I have spent 11 years believing that my job was simply to observe and report, and that whatever happened after that was someone else's responsibility, someone else's decision, made by people wiser and more informed than me. I watched you, over the past 100 hours, refuse to let fear make your decisions for you, even when fear would have been the easier, more forgivable choice. I think it's time I did the same." I stood up, walked to the small waste recycler built into the corner of my office, the kind used for disposing of sensitive physical documents that cannot simply be deleted from a digital archive, and I opened my private notebook to its first page. Nora watched from the chair, silent, as I began, 1 page at a time, feeding 90 hours of the most honest scientific work I had ever produced into a machine designed to reduce it to nothing more than raw, reusable material. The first page went in easily. The second was harder. By the 10th page, my hands were shaking, not from doubt, but from the enormous, irreversible weight of what I was doing, the understanding that I was not simply protecting one girl or one species, but making a choice that would define the rest of my career, and possibly the rest of my life, in a direction I could never fully take back. I fed in every page, every observation about her body preparing for damage before it occurred, every reading of a cardiovascular system optimized beyond anything the Confederation had ever measured, every note about a cognitive process built for speed under pressure, about a pain response that filtered threats instead of simply registering them, about a species shaped by a world that had tried, for thousands of years, to kill every single one of her ancestors, and had instead built something the entire universe had never once had to reckon with. By the time the last page disappeared into the recycler, the small room smelled faintly of processed paper, and I felt, standing there, lighter than I had felt in 100 hours, and heavier than I had ever felt in my entire career, both at once, in a way I did not fully understand until much later. I sat back down at my console and wrote the official report, the second version, the careful, unremarkable one, in less than 20 minutes, because after 100 hours of knowing exactly what the truth was, writing something smaller than the truth turned out to be the easiest lie I had ever told. Baseline adaptive resilience, consistent with Class 9 hazard world origin. Subject demonstrates elevated physical durability and situational awareness proportionate to homeworld conditions. No unusual capability escalation identified. No containment recommendation required. Recommend standard limited contact protocols. Proceed on schedule. I submitted it to the Central Archive, and Director Vray's response came back less than an hour later. A single line, formal and brief, closing the diagnostic file and authorizing Nora's release back to standard intake processing, the first small step toward the limited, cautious, but ultimately open contact protocol that every new species eventually received once cleared. I walked back into the lab, where Nora was waiting, already dressed in her own clothes instead of the gray intake suit, looking, for the first time since hour 1, like someone about to walk out of a door instead of into one. "It's done," I told her, "officially. You're cleared for standard release." "What did you write?" she asked. "Something small enough that no one will ever come looking for you or your people again," I said. "Something that lets you go home and keep becoming whatever you're going to become without anyone deciding, out of fear, that they need to stop you first." She looked at me for a long time, and something in her expression, calm and steady and quietly grateful, told me she understood exactly what that had cost me, even though I had not told her, and never would. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "Thank me in 100 years, when your people are standing somewhere in this confederation as equals, instead of a footnote in a hazard file, and no one ever has to know how close it came to going the other way." She smiled then, a real one, small and brief, but genuine, the first one I had seen from her in 100 hours. "I think I will," she said. "Thank you, Dr. Kaur, for all of it." She walked out of the lab a few minutes later, escorted toward the transport that would begin the long journey back toward the edge of Confederate space, and eventually, home. I stood alone in the quiet lab for a long time afterward, looking at the empty diagnostic chair, thinking about the 2 notebooks that no longer existed, one submitted, one burned, and about the strange, unshakable certainty that I had made, without any hesitation left in me by the end, exactly the right choice. I never told Director Vray what I had actually documented in those first 90 pages. I never told anyone. I carried it alone, for the rest of my career, the single truth I had chosen to protect instead of report, and I never once regretted it. Not through every quiet year that followed, watching from a careful distance as humanity's slow, cautious integration into the wider Confederation began, unremarkable and unrestricted, exactly the way I had written it. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that first hour, about a tired 17-year-old girl asking if my machine was broken, and I think about how close an entire species came to being locked away out of fear of exactly the qualities that should have earned them welcome instead. I think about the notebook I burned, page by page, and the report I wrote in its place, small and quiet, and in every way that actually mattered, the most honest thing I have ever done in my entire life. I was a scientist for 11 years before I met her. I learned, in those final 9 hours, that sometimes the most scientific thing a person can do is decide, deliberately and completely, what the truth is actually for.